Okay, everybody out there, welcome to a very special Role Player with a Thousand Faces episode. This is Through the Rifts with Kevin Siembieda, and I am like super happy to have Kevin here today. He is, I'd like to say, first of all, the first guest that I have ever actually had on twice. He is a man who is so creative, he required 2 episodes just to contain his creativity. Um, I I think Kevin, for those of you watching, probably does not really need an introduction, and any sort of normal or basic introduction that I gave for him would probably be the same stuff that you've heard before. So I wanted to introduce Kevin just simply by saying that as most of you that watch my channel know, I am a Gen Xer. So I have been impacted by some of the greatest mythological stories, contemporary stories that we have today. So I actually saw Star Wars in the theater, and I'm talking Star Wars, not A New Hope. I'm talking about just Star Wars with the title crawl at the front. I grew up on Lord of the Rings in book form when there was only, I think there was an animated Ralph Bakshi
Yep.
adaptation that floundered and nosedived, unfortunately. And uh, I actually grew up as well on the original Transformers, the original Transformers cartoon, and the not the original GI Joe, but the second iteration of GI Joe, the 5-part Hasbro Marvel co-production miniseries talking about the mass device and all of that. So there are a few things in my life that I've carried through with me from my childhood and that resonate in my mind today, and up there with Star Wars and up there with the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's original books and Bakshi's adaptation, and up there with GI Joe and with Transformers are the worlds of the Palladium Megaverse. And I think that says a lot. That here I am at my current age, which I won't reveal. I'm not going to reveal. But I'm here at my current age, and I am still thinking, talking, excited by, and just mystified by the worlds that Kevin has created. I think for a lot of Gen Xers, we all feel the same. So, Kevin, on behalf of the viewers, on behalf of myself, on behalf of Generation X, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I'm very flattered.
Oh,
That was quite an intro.
it's absolutely from the heart and true. It's absolutely true. I am very thankful for you to be coming back here a second time. I understand that this is your second interview for
Yeah,
today, so it's a bit of a marathon for you. How are you holding up, sir?
I'm feeling fine. I'm a blabbermouth, so I'm good to go.
Yes, I don't know if I'd call you a blabbermouth, but I'd maybe call you a fountain of amazing stories. So to let everybody know what we're going to be doing today, we're going to be running a 3-part interview with Kevin. So in part one, we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of Palladium Books and its founding and what it was like going through those early days. In part two of our interview, we're going to be talking to Kevin about game mastering and some of his ideas, some of his advice, some of his tips and tricks for running a good game. And then in part three of this interview, we're going to be talking to any fledgling or seasoned creators out there who would like to maybe work on their own settings, work on their own worlds, work on their own characters. And I think it's going to be a really exciting talk. So each one of these parts is going to be separated by a 10-minute intermission because even Kevin, even the Muhammad Ali of giving RPG talks needs to take a small break between rounds. So Kevin, let's just start off by talking a little bit about your history. You started off wanting to be a comic book artist, but then ended up as a game designer and a publisher. What caused the change in course?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think I realized that well, it took me a while to realize that I'm a storyteller because I love all forms of stories, movies, TV, comic books, novels, live theater, you name it. I love it. So I naturally gravitated towards role playing when I heard about it. But yeah, no, my dad used to love telling the story about how I apparently trumped out of my bedroom one day at 9 years old and pronounced that I was going to be a comic book artist and writer when I grew up. And then I spent like the next 14 years working towards those goals. And in fact, when I started Palladium Books, it was just supposed to be a temporary thing until I broke into comics. And then the company started to take off, and I'm like, this is pretty good. Maybe I'll put off getting into comic books a little bit longer. And 40 years later, I guess I better get into comics soon or just keep going.
Right, or yeah, that's exactly. I mean, you kind of a little course correction right now might be like catastrophic for what you've been
Yeah.
doing. But if you were working for 14 years toward becoming a comic book artist and illustrator, what can you tell me a little bit about the idea of giving that up in a way? Do you feel you
Sure.
gave that up, or do you feel like, I get to do a different sort of storytelling?
Yeah, for a while it kind of felt like I was giving it up. I was lucky growing up in Detroit when I did. It was a hotbed for comic book creators. So we had, we had a couple major awesome conventions twice
Hmm.
a year. And I got to meet all these amazing people. And for me, I think it felt very attainable to become a comic book artist because I knew a couple guys, like I knew Terry Austin, who would go on to become a famous inker, especially on the X-Men with John Byrne.
Hmm. Yep.
I knew Richard Buckler, who would create, oh gosh, why can't I think of the name? Deathlock.
That's right.
Uh,
Yes.
and he did, he illustrated Fantastic Four and a bunch of
Hmm.
other stuff. I got to meet all the guys who were legends at the time, Neil Adams and all these other people. So it just felt very real and something attainable. And when I started role playing, it was just more almost a lark. It
Mm.
was like, I mean, I was serious about it, but it's just sort of this fun hobby I had, and it was really my guys, the Defilers at the Detroit Gaming Center, who encouraged me to even get started because they're like, Kev, you've written this whole new game now, and because I tried to shop it around to
Hmm.
every business that was going at the time, and
Mm.
got rejected by everyone except Judges Guild, and their offer just wasn't very lucrative. So I said, nah, forget it. And then they convinced me, Kev, you've got publishing experience. You published your own comic book when you're in college. You've done fanzines. You've worked with other publishers, Noble Comics. Um, do it yourself. And my reaction was no, but at the same time, I'm like, yeah, I should do this. And so I did. And for a long, long time, Matthew, I considered myself more of an artist.
Mm.
When people would say, "What do you do?" I'd say, I'm an artist. Even though Palladium was up and running, and my comic book background served me well because I mean we did Ninja Turtles and
Yep.
Robotech and
Yep.
some other things. So they're all kind of interrelated. I mean, storytelling is storytelling,
Yeah.
and I think something people don't think about much with comics, although you're seeing it now with the Marvel movies, it's world building,
Mm.
and I love the world building. So, but yeah, I would say the first 15 years of Palladium, in my mind, this was all just temporary.
Right.
Even though I'm a $2 million company, and I'm
Yeah.
thinking, it's just temporary until I do comic books.
But it's interesting because you say, like, even the way I phrased the question when I look back on it now in retrospect, like, it's probably wrong. And like the teacher in me wants to think about this and kind of consider that. So I said, what is it like? What was it like giving it up? But in a way, it sounds like you didn't really give it up. You just sort of shifted that creativity to something else. And of course, we know you're still illustrating and all of that stuff at that time, right? So in a way, it was just as you said. It was world building, but maybe by a slightly different name
Yeah.
because you're getting people to work for you and under you to create these things that you're kind of sketching in your head.
Well,
in
in fact,
your life?
it was Eric Wojcik who one day, we're talking about, I forget what we're talking about, and he goes, "Well, Kev, all the characters in your games are basically superheroes."
Mm,
And I'm like, "No, they're not." And he's like, "Yeah, sure they are."
mm.
And he starts pointing out examples, and I'm like, "Yeah, I guess I guess he's right. They are
Yeah.
really are fundamentally, your classic heroes and superheroes." So
Mm. So what was that? What was that like then? That very first like dipping your toe in the water. So you decide to start and found your company. How did that? Was that scary in itself? Were you because I'm thinking about a lot of us, even maybe of course even myself and others out there that are like, I want to start. I want to work for myself. I want to do my own thing. What was it like to start Palladium?
well, I think I'm a little bit crazy, so it was exciting, not scary.
Okay.
I had big ideas, big dreams. I say part of the secret of my success
Uh-huh.
was um, I was like too dumb to know better. I went in it full of piss and vinegar, as they say. And if I was just talking to someone yesterday about this, where I you know I had big expectations because of my comic book background.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking I need to be producing games that are selling tens of thousands minimum, and hundreds of thousands ideally, because those were the kind of numbers comic books did. And so, had I been more involved with the rest of the industry, their standard was like, man, if you sell 5,000 copies, that's a hit. And if you
Mm-hmm.
sell, 20,000 copies of something in the lifetime of the product,
Mm.
it's a mega hit. Well, in that case, pretty much everything we've ever done, from Palladium Fantasy to Heroes Unlimited to Beyond the Supernatural, are mega hits. But to me, it's like, shucks, we only sold,
Right.
5,000 copies of the Mechanoid Invasion. It's like, yeah, that's a flop,
Yeah.
in my mind. And I just kept pushing myself and trying to do stuff.
So do you think that the fact that you kind of unknowingly set your standards maybe higher than what was expected for the industry at the time, do you credit that maybe with giving you a really good, because you can count like the hairs on your head, and that's the number of role-playing game companies that like start up and then do okay and maybe even have a good successful product and a good but then they just sort of fade away. But Palladium's, here you go, still standing strong after all these decades. Do you think that maybe that ignorance of failure, or that maybe setting the bar higher, has something to do with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then when I started to hit some of those things, I'm like, okay, now we're cooking. But yeah, I really didn't know better. I mean, when I started out, like a lot of guys who get involved in role playing and want to do role playing companies, start their own role playing company, I didn't know better, and I learned everything by research and trial and error. And as a little company, I mean, I started out really poor, and my seed money, half of that was $3,000 to do the Mechanoid Invasion,
Mm-hmm.
and half of that was borrowed from a friend's mom.
Mm.
So, it was just, let's figure this stuff out. So I'm the artist, I'm the writer, I'm the game designer, I'm the art director,
Yeah.
I'm shipping and receiving. I'm sweeping the floors. I mean,
Yeah.
and this is all out of my house. I had bought this little tiny house, or was buying this tiny little house from my aunt, and on a land contract. And one bedroom is my library. The dining room was my work area, my studio, and the back porch and the kitchen was my warehouse.
Mm.
It's just this little startup operation. And I had help from in ideas and input from Eric, and of course from Alex, my best friend. And but it's all just trying to figure stuff out as you go. And I'm one of those, again, crazy people who find that challenging.
Right. How was that beginning? How were those beginning steps then? Because I would imagine that you're trying to balance, you're trying to balance obviously your personal life with the work, but at the same time you need to get the work off the ground in order to, generate like an income or generate something to sort of build your foundation on. What was the first year or two like for you?
It was rough. I was involved in the Detroit Gaming Center. I was one of the founders, and I was on the board of director, and I had to step down from that, which disappointed Eric Wojcik, because he and I pretty much, there's about six of us who were like core people who really founded it, and he was sorry to see me go. I mean, I would still run events and stuff and be a sounding board, but I wasn't there all the time anymore, except to run my Saturday night game.
Hmm.
And then you're right, there's decisions you have to make. So like when I was in art school, I saw a lot of these people who they had big dreams for art, and then they would go out and get a good job, and the next thing you know, they're not pursuing their art anymore because they're making real money, and that's seductive,
Mm.
especially when you're young and you want a car and a girl
Hmm.
and lots of things. And I had an opportunity. I was actually a bartender for a Japanese restaurant, and they were expanding. They opened up a second site, and I was stunned when the guy said, "Hey, I want you to be my second at this new restaurant." And the money was awesome at the time, plus tips. And I actually turned it down, uh, because I was afraid I would, if I got into that, it would be a trap, and I'd
Mm.
never get out. So I was sort of a starving artist, because I turned that job down. In fact, I
Mm.
quit that job. Um, and I devoted all my time to becoming a freelance illustrator and starting Palladium. So I'm getting some decent illustrative work that's paying the bills initially, but I needed to do Palladium more and more. And as it started to take off, I stopped doing that too and put all my attention in there. So I mean,
Mm.
I'm in 1983, before,
Hmm.
just before Palladium Fantasy comes out, I asked this young lady to marry me, and I explained to her that if everything goes according to plan, I personally, not the company, should be making like $90,000 a year in 3 years. And she leans forward and kisses me on the cheek and says, "I'll marry you anyway." Because at the time I'm making like $10,000.
Right.
And she's making more as key punch operator. Um, but 3 years later, I'm making $90,000. I'm going, woohoo. So, a lot of it's just sticking to it
Yeah.
and being focused
Yeah.
and following your dream.
For you, like I can kind of tell from listening to you that you have this confidence in yourself and this sort of inner strength that this is going to happen. And even the fact that you like what's interesting to me is that you actually quote a salary for yourself after 3 years. So this sort of tells me that you're thinking and calculating and working ahead, and you kind of have this plan, right? What would you say though? There, like I was saying before, there are as many RPG companies that were started as there are like hairs on your head, where people have trouble with that. Is there
Yeah.
anything that you would, maybe something in general you might want to tell someone as they set out on their own mission to start their own company? Is there something maybe you wish you had known, or you think they should know, as far as keeping the company going and growing it goes at the beginning?
Well, I think make sure it's what you want to do. I think a lot of people don't realize how much work is involved. I mean, it's very demanding. Like I said, I was doing everything, and um, you have to really want it, and be focused on it, and make sure you're not punishing yourself. Like Eric
Yeah.
Wojcik in 1990, I think it was, started Phage Press and came out with the Amber Diceless game, which was an
Mm.
instant hit, sold like 20,000
Right.
copies in 6 months or something. And but like a year after he started a company, he comes back to me and says, "Kev, yeah, Kev, I've got more respect for you than ever.
Right.
I hate being a publisher.
Right.
I hate running a company." it's not what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
And that's very valid. I mean, it's very demanding. If it's not for you, you either need to find that partner who can help you handle that part, or get out. Maybe you're better off being a freelancer or a
Yeah.
consultant or something. It's a lot of hard work. I talk to a lot of small companies, and sometimes there's just these intangibles. I've met some supremely talented people, but they don't go anywhere because they either don't have the energy, or they don't have the vision, or they don't have the heart. And that's not a criticism.
Right.
It's just the reality. You have to. I always felt I was blessed in that I knew what I wanted, and I'm a pretty driven person. So once I see that goal, I'm all in, and I'm and I'm going
Right.
for it.
There was an interesting question actually in the chat. So a fellow by the name of Derazgo was asking, how long, if you don't mind asking, how long was it before you felt economically comfortable and you're like, I can do this?
Um,
Was there a point where things turned and you're like, here I've reached a comfortable spot?
yeah, I would say that was after Robotech, so about 5, 6 years in. Because in the entertainment business, I think it's true of most entertainment businesses. You're only as big as your last hit.
Yeah.
And so when Palladium Fantasy came out, it was, again, it was below my expectations, because I'm thinking, we need to
Right.
sell a ton of books. But it was actually a hit. We sold like 5 or 6 thousand copies in its first year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
um and and we had the quiet hit. I think we talked about this in our earlier interview, where people don't realize it, but the weapons and
That's
armor
right.
weapons series was actually our first big hit. But now I was smart enough to put all the money I was making on it back into the company. And that's, so I guess one of my advice to people is trying to start a company or do anything like this is be flexible,
Mm-hmm.
be self-aware,
Mm-hmm.
learn from other people. So I did the Mechanoid first because I actually created and wrote the Palladium Fantasy game first. But I knew how I wanted to publish it. I knew I wanted it to be one big book. Um, and But I couldn't afford it. It cost a ton of money to do it so at the time, box games or hardcovers were the way everyone did stuff. And I sat back and went, shucks, I can't afford that. To do a hardcover was extremely
Yeah.
expensive. Box was even worse. And I needed to start generating cash to
Mm-hmm.
build the company. So I then went back and created the Mechanoids as a sort of introductory to my stuff. And I'm into science fiction as well as fantasy and horror. I'm into everything. I love
Mm-hmm.
stories. So I did the Mechanoid invasion, and this was a real learning experience. I learned several things from this book. So first of all, it's comic book size. You can't really tell compared to an
Right.
actual book. It's comic book
Right.
size because that was something I knew about, and I knew a printer who could make this book for like 40 cents a copy, right? At 10,000 or at 5,000 copies. So I did this, and then I thought, well, gee, a lot of role-playing games in the day were selling for 10, 15 bucks. I'll make this 375
Right.
because it's only costing me 40 cents.
Right.
So then I go to Gen Con, and my buddy Matthew Ballant makes this little weapon book. Because again, back in the day, you didn't have computers. You couldn't Google
Mm-hmm.
on your freaking phone.
Right.
What does a halberd look like?
Yes. Right.
And people didn't know. And D&D is already this giant. It's taken off like crazy. And so Matt realized that a lot of people don't understand things. So he does this little book with these crappy little but accurate
Yeah. Yeah.
line drawings. And so we go to our first Gen Con. We have one little table. It's just the Mechanoids and the weapon book. And so first of all, person after person after person, when I say, yeah, it's a complete game and it's only 375, and they go, why? What's wrong with it?
Right.
Because
It's too
it's
cheap.
too cheap.
Yeah.
It wasn't what the market expected. If it was, $8 or $10, I probably would have sold 3 times. but instead they look at it and go, what's wrong with it? The other thing I noticed was Matt's weapon book. For every one of these I'm selling, Matt's selling 4 or 5 of these. Now, granted, it was only $1, but I saw this need for people need a book full of cool weapons. And so they know what they are, how long they are, the kind of damage they do, because Matt came up with sort of a generic-y, comparative system.
Hmm.
So after Gen Con, and this is about being aware, being willing to say, okay, I made a mistake. How do I fix it?
Right.
Um, Here's an opportunity. So if Matt's book, I saw this opportunity, the question was, how do you capitalize on it? And I capitalized on it by making the weapon and armor source book.
Right.
We added a bunch of armors. It took, another 3 or 4 months worth of research. We blew up Matt's weapon drawings a little bit. They're still the same simple drawings, but simple and effective.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
what the market wanted. So, I mean, I must have sold 20,000 of these in the first year it was released.
Yeah.
And then it continued to go on. We sold like 120,000 of these in the first 10 years. And it wasn't my first idea. It wasn't the Palladium fantasy game, but I saw a way to start making some money to do what I really wanted to
Right.
do.
So you were willing to sort of set maybe your first ideas aside in order to go for something that you're also interested in, but you also see a potential market for it. And you also see people that are interested in it. So one of the interesting things about, so I've been talking to Kevin since our initial interview like several months ago, and one of the great things that I can tell you that I'm privy to is that he's always asking about, what can I do for the fans?
Yep.
And what can I do for those people out there that buy my books and enjoy them and all of that stuff? That is something that is always on your mind. Why to what do you attribute this to? I mean, I don't believe that it's just business savvy. I mean, do you have a genuine what's the connection between you and the fans?
Well, yeah. So first of all, to me, my fan base is just sort of an extension of my gaming group.
Hmm.
Whenever I'm writing, I talked about this a little bit in my earlier interview for Gen Con too, is whenever I'm writing a book, I'm thinking about my audience. And it always has to have stuff that excites you personally.
Yeah.
And whenever I hear someone talk about their vision, it kind of grits on me because it usually means this is my idea and I don't want to change it.
Yeah.
And it's like, but what does your audience want? And does it hit all the notes? Does it sing? Is this something that people are going to look at and go, wow, this is fun, this is
Mm.
exciting? I've seen lots of game publishers who fail because they lose sight of the fact it's a game,
Yeah.
it's fun.
Yeah.
And so I'm always thinking about what my audience wants, what will get them excited. And ironically, I often role play. If I'm a player, how am I going to react to this? Do I think it's cool? Do I think it's stupid? Is it dull? Is it too slow? Is it something I go, oh yeah, I want to play that, or ooh, I hope I don't run into that creature or villain.
Right.
Um, it's always on my mind. And then Palladium fans in particular, but role players in general, nicest freaking people on the planet. They really care about their hobby. They treat you, so nicely. They appreciate everything thing you do. It's hard not to love these men and women, and these kids.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And plus, from a business point of view, you need to know your market
Yeah.
because ultimately you're selling to them. They're the guys who are going to keep you going.
Yeah.
So you need to listen to them. Sometimes all their ideas or complaints aren't always valid. Um, you have to kind of sort through those, but you
Mm.
need to listen to them and think about what they have to say and then give them what they want. And fortunately for me, it's also what I want.
Yeah, and
So
it's
it's a win-win.
and you're able to adapt. I mean, that's the interesting thing because I mean, anyone that knows the Palladium Megaverse knows, and it doesn't surprise me at all that you would say I'm interested in all kinds of genres. I mean, the Palladium Megaverse is really just like it's got just about any genre you can imagine, and it all kind of pivots around the riffs that's kind of there at the center. the Rifts RPG. And what's interesting is it's more of an excuse to like take you on journeys connecting between different genres, and it sort of enables you to go from one to the other. So to me, that's sort of like a really interesting thing is I think that people that are often successful, they have a little bit of an interest in just about everything. And then they sort of take a look at the market and they figure out where their interests sort of overlay with the interests of their people, of their fans, of their fan base. And that's I think something that, to be honest, I'm kind of like one of those guys too. I'm interested in a lot of different things, and that's one of the reasons I've followed Palladium for like decades now. Is because if I want to play horror, I can play horror. If I want to play science fiction, I can do that. I can go just about anywhere. Um, how was it then? So after those initial couple books, was it what were the next few? Was it Palladium Fantasy and Heroes Unlimited that came out,
Yeah,
or do I
yeah.
have the
So
order?
the actual so what happened was we came out with the two books. So Mechanoids was a trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
Came out with the next two books in those. And then we also came out with a couple more weapon books, Weapons and Castles, Weapons and
That's
Assassins.
right.
And then in 1983, we came out with the first version of the Palladium
Oh
Fantasy role playing
yeah,
game.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And again, this is sort of an example of adapting also because it's a soft cover book.
Mm-hmm.
And the main reason it's a soft cover book is I still couldn't afford to do hardcovers or a box game. And at the time, doing large 8.5 by 11, what they used to call trade paperbacks,
Right.
was a new technology, and it was cheap. So to do that book as a hardcover would have cost me $5 or $6 at the time each. I think that cost me $2 as a softcover book.
Mm.
That I could afford, and that I could create as a 336-page book or whatever it was. And then it's funny. A lot of people thought were actually pretty surprised that I did a fantasy book as my first major game because I'm a superhero guy.
Mm-hmm.
But it just wasn't there, and that's where sometimes you have to trust your gut and go with the flow. It just wasn't there. It was percolating in the back of my head, and like a year later, I'm like, yeah, I'm ready to produce that superhero book,
Mm-hmm.
and that was Heroes Unlimited, and that was followed by the Ninja Turtles and then Robotech, and then we were off to the
Yeah, I
races.
was gonna say, like, that's a very short, I mean, in my mind, that seems like a very short time through which to suddenly acquire these like enormous properties. But to be entrusted with those is, I mean, it's the ultimate compliment, I think. When that is happening, is the megaversal like is your basic megaversal system, is all of this kind of in your mind and you're starting to sort of cement the pieces, or was
Yeah,
this
yeah.
something you kind of had an idea for early on?
It's something I sort of had early on. Um, so first of all, from day one, I wanted to produce a game system that was mostly the same. I mean, certain books, I don't think I was sophisticated enough as a game designer and writer to come out with something that would cover every genre at the time. I think I'm there now, but so every book, Heroes was actually kind of different, quite different from
Hmm.
Palladium Fantasy, although the core rules, the 8 attributes, the alignments, how the combat worked were identical. But it went off in different directions. And again, in part because I'm exploring new ideas and new approaches and things. But I wanted to do a megaversal. Basically, I didn't have the word yet, but I wanted to do a megaverse so that if you learn one game, you can play them all if you want to. And again, the gaming center was great because it was like this hot house where I saw what people wanted and how gamers think and what they do. And so, one of the complaints all the time is someone would come in with some great new game. Look at Call of
Yeah.
Cthulhu,
Yes.
and they're like, oh, that's great, but it's completely different than D&D or RuneQuest or Bushido or anything else that was out there. And it was frustrating because if you wanted to play this new game, you have to learn a whole new set of rules. And while gamers don't necessarily mind that, after you learn 6 or 7 or 8, different game systems, it's like, you know what, I'm going to stick with the one I like the most.
Mm.
So I wanted to do something that encompassed everything. Plus, I like that. When I was starting out, there were big arguments about how you couldn't combine fantasy and magic with science fiction and technology, and I thought that was a bunch of
I was
malarkey.
gonna say you've totally blown that out of the water. Like,
um, but I mean, it was a real thing where people just insisted it couldn't work, and so I started to incorporate those elements in my Defilers game. So in fact, it was one of my Defilers, Tom, who years later pointed out that almost every aspect of Rifts was in the Defiler game. And I didn't even realize it until he brought it up. And my initial reaction was, no, that's not right.
yeah,
But he was right. I mean, I
yeah.
had the beginnings of techno wizardry. We had dimensional travel. We had alternate worlds. We had horror. We had a vampire. One whole level was vampires. It was a vampire kingdom, which was the very first source book or world book for Rifts. Um, all those elements I had been fooling around with almost from the beginning.
Where did the idea for SDC and MDC come from?
Um, so SDC came out of Bach. My buddy and artist Kevin Long
Mm.
was big into boxing, and I was a little bit into boxing, and
Oh,
I got
that's the
really
example you use in the books. That's right.
so in boxing, these guys, their bodies are so well conditioned that they can take a punch that, for you and me,
Yeah,
we'd be doubled over with one punch. But they've conditioned their bodies and they're stronger, so they can take a bunch of punches before it really starts to weigh on them.
right.
And then MDC just kind of grew out of. I like the idea of having. Let's face it, like a tank is not quite an MDC, but kind of is, because if you've got a stick, a sword, a pistol, a shotgun, it's not going to do anything to a tank.
Yeah.
It was like a whole nother category of armor, and I like that, especially as I was fooling around with the mechanoids. It wasn't in the original mechanoids, but I incorporated it in a later version of it. And then when Robotech came out, I'm like, oh my gosh,
There
let's
you
get
go.
their
It's like
mega
the
damage.
Yeah, it's the perfect kind of delivery system
Yeah.
for your system. Um, had you ever thought about, and this is something that I've been itching to ask you this since my first interview and it got trimmed off because I didn't have time. Did you ever think about releasing the Megaversal system as a kind of generic system in the way that maybe Steve Jackson has GURPS or maybe Monty Cook has Cipher System? Had you ever considered that at all, or
Uh, yeah, absolutely. I thought about it. I think there's two main reasons why I didn't go that route, especially in the first decade. Um, because first of all, I like the idea of the rules being in each new setting. That way, people didn't have to, oh wow, this looks great, but oh shucks, it needs another book to play.
yeah,
I
right.
didn't like that. Especially in the early days, one still with Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm not slamming them on this. I'm just
Hmm.
saying that as someone who grew up very poor, who didn't have the money, I look at D&D and I'm like, oh, I gotta buy the player rule book, and I gotta buy the game master
Yeah,
rule book, and I
yeah.
gotta buy the monster manual, and maybe some other thing. Before I know it, I'm at $100, or nowadays it's more than that.
I know, right? It's $100 for almost one book these days,
Yeah,
actually. Yeah,
and so as someone who was poor, I wanted to give people the complete package.
yeah.
And I wanted to give them enough to play with if they couldn't afford the other source books. And that's really where that came from. Um, and then it just really seemed to work, because that way, if someone's picking up Palladium Fantasy, it's a complete game. If they're into giant robots, they pick up Robotech, it's a complete game.
Yeah.
They don't have to search for something else. And also, it's part of a marketing thing too, because if you see this great book you want to play, but now you got to search out the rules and maybe
Right.
they're not there.
Right.
Do you come back next week or next month to buy the rule book?
Right.
and that source book that you really thought, that caught your attention?
You know what's interesting though, I have to say this, when and this kind of nicely leads into my next question, maybe one of the last questions I'll ask before we take a break here. But I was wondering, what led to the idea of adapting riffs for Savage Worlds? Because I went out and bought the Savage Worlds core set just for riffs. So I was actually doing the opposite of what you just said. But I mean, on the
Yeah.
other hand, I'm kind of a ringer. You know, we all know if it's riffs, I'm going to go out there and buy it. So to play, if I'm going to play it, what led to that? Because that really, in my imagination, and I don't know if this is true, but in my imagination, this really shook things up for Palladium, and it really helped to introduce the setting, the game, and then to like a whole new generation of players. How did that partnership between Palladium and Pinnacle come about for Savage Rifts?
Well, I really can't take too much credit for it other than saying, yeah, let's do it. It was really the idea of Sean Patrick Fannin. And I'd known Fannin for years and liked the gentleman. And he loved riffs and he loved Savage Worlds and had done a bunch of work with um, Shane Hensley, the owner of Pinnacle Games Entertainment. And so he had broached the subject with me a couple of years earlier, and I said, "Yeah, I guess so." And mainly, so the other thing too is I knew Sean was a good writer. I knew he was
Mm,
passionate about riffs. I knew he was a big fan of riffs, so I thought he would do a really good job, as opposed to someone coming up to me cold and saying, "Hey, we love riffs. Let's do it."
right.
Well, everyone always says they love your stuff,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
if they want it, and then do they? Do they know it? Are they going to be loyal to it? And with Fannin, I thought he would be, and he introduced me to Shane Hensley, and Shane seemed like a straight up guy, and I liked him, and I thought, yeah, let's give it a whirl. And like you said, I thought it would open it up to another audience, and perhaps a new generation, and I figured, I got nothing to lose. I think they'll do a nice job. And, I had, rights of approval for the writing and the
Hmm.
art. And
Hmm.
I figured, what the heck? And, they've done a great job. In fact, they're only getting better and better.
Yeah, I what I like about the idea is I like the idea of there being these two rule sets that basically cover the same this not the same material because there are some minor differences, but
Mhm.
I like the idea of like what mood am I in today? Am I in a Palladium mood for Palladium riffs or I am in a Savage Worlds mood? And I like the option of being able to kind of switch between the two. And one thing which I've told Kevin, but I don't know if I ever said it here, the thing that actually got me back to playing with my friends. So I played Palladium Riffs in high school. That's when I started, and I won't say how many decades ago that was. But one of the things that got me back was we started up a Palladium Riffs game later on. When the pandemic happened, we decided to play through Zoom, and we're like, let's just do a sequel to our game from 3 decades before, and we'll sort of make it be like the Unforgiven, a bunch of old men strapping on power armor for one last adventure. And what's interesting is at that point, I was like, oh, wait a minute. So we played that for a while, and then we're like, oh, what is Savage Worlds Rift? We went out and we checked it out, and we're like, oh, this is cool too. And it was interesting to see that there's this big community that kind of like has the Palladium version, they've got the Savage Worlds version. Um, it's just been really good, I think, for
And it kind of mesh
yeah.
because in a lot of ways, and that's changing a little bit with upcoming books, but a lot of
Hmm.
the Savage World, because they're adapting my world, they're really good at succinctly boiling things down and saying, here's the high points.
Yeah.
And then they also offer things we don't do, like they're offering maps,
Hmm.
and they have adventures,
Yeah.
or more adventures. And so, like, if you prefer the Palladium rules, you could take their books and use the maps and the adventure ideas and maybe get that overview again and go, oh, hey, I forgot about this, or I forgot
Hmm.
about that, or I never quite looked at it that way before. Um, and likewise, Savage World players can say, well, I really like this. I wish they went more in depth. and then they can buy our books
Yes,
and
they
get the
complement each
detailed
other.
world. Yeah.
Hmm.
So it's this really great symbiotic relationship.
It's interesting because even if I'm playing Savage Worlds riffs, I've got my Palladium riffs right by my desk, and that's where I'm getting like my setting and background from. And I'll even steal like, because you're big on house rules and things like that, I'm pretty sure, but I'll even steal stuff, not steal it, but I'll take it from
Yeah,
the original Palladium and I'll use certain rules for
of
that
course. Yeah.
in Savage Worlds and vice versa. Um, so let me ask you this, and I think that we'll probably head off to a break here in a moment. But what's the next step for Palladium? Anything coming up, or we've talked about the history, but anything?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Oh,
So
maybe too
so
big a
first of
question.
all, I so Fannin left the Savage Rifts development team, and they brought in a new guy, Sean Owen Robertson. And Sean and I got to be pretty friendly as we worked together on these projects because he was basically is still the line manager
Hmm.
for Savage Rifts, and we hit it off and we started to become really friendly. And I realize he has a lot of the things I'm looking for someone to help take Palladium to the next level and to continue my legacy. Because I'm 65 and I love what I do and I hope to be doing it for another 20 or 30 years. But I don't know. I beat cancer. I have type 2 diabetes that is under control. But come on. A few years ago, I got hit by a car while walking on the sidewalk. You don't know what's going to happen. Um, so 2 weeks ago, Sean joined Palladium Books. So he's going to continue to be the line manager on Pinnacle freelance, but he's my creative and business partner.
That is exciting news, and I know that you made that announcement. I know this is a loaded question because Kevin had already made the announcement earlier today. And what I'm going to do is he did an interview with Sean
Yeah,
earlier on today. I don't have the link, but I'm going to actually, after this is over, I'm going to put the link in the description below so you can go over, and I'm sure he's got a lot of cool information and
yeah,
details for you there in that interview. I don't want to tread on ground which Sean has
yeah.
already covered. But for right now, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say thank you for being with us here for this first part, the history of Palladium Books, of our interview with Kevin Siembieda. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up an intermission. It's going to be about 10 minutes. Kevin is going to go back into his corner. I'm going to throw a little stool underneath him, and then a towel around his neck, and then somebody's going to come out and like get his shoulders like loosened up there, and give him some advice. And they're going to clean the blood off of like his forehead, and he might say something like, cut me, Mickey. Go ahead and do it. I don't know what's going to happen. So we're going to take a little break. If you like what you're seeing so far, please do think about liking and subscribing to the channel, and even better, maybe sharing something would be really great if you could share it. But we will be back in 10 minutes with Kevin for part two of Through the Rifts. Thank you for watching. We'll be right back. Go. Hello, everybody. We're back for round two with, as I was saying, the Muhammad Ali of role-playing games. We're here with Kevin Siembieda. We're going through the rifts. And so our first half we just concluded. We were talking a little bit about the history of Palladium and how it progressed through the years. And now we're actually going to get into tips and tricks and things like that around the table for role playing. But kind of before we did that, I wanted to throw out like one or two little questions that were in the chat that were kind of left over and I think are really interesting ones. One here is from, and I'm so sorry, Brandon, if I say your name wrong, but Brandon Loizidis. I'm so sorry if I said that wrong. So he says, and I totally agree with him, Palladium products have some of the best artwork in the industry. And you had mentioned, of course, Kevin Long, who has been like a mainstay of Palladium for like ever. Was this by design, or did you just sort of fall into it? What happened? How did you get these great artists, Kevin? What did you do? Who did
Well,
you make
I
a
think
deal with?
I, I think I had the advantage of being an artist myself. I had a good idea, a good eye for other artists, and plus my comic book sensibilities. I mean, a lot of these guys are comic book oriented. Some of them are comic book artists. Like one of our new guys
Mm.
that we used a lot is Stephen Cummings, and he does
Mm-hmm.
a lot of work for Marvel Comics. Ramon Perez, I was his first professional job. Um, and he went on to work for Marvel Comics.
Mm.
Freddie Williams went off to do art for
For a lot. For
DC and a lot
what
of other
hasn't
things.
he done artwork for? Yeah.
Yeah, right. So I tend to gravitate towards comic book artists, and I have a good eye for artists. So
So that's
yeah,
your 14. There's our answer right there. Like circling back to the beginning when I said, "Oh, you're 14 years." Like nothing wasted here, right? So if you spend 12, 14 years preparing to become a comic
yeah,
book artist, I mean, you're developing your eye for telling a story visually, and then maybe like also for communicating it, like an editor or a writer telling you what they're going for and you recommending, well, maybe we should actually do it this way because visually it would look better. And now here you are with
yep.
your own like personal portfolio of artists. You're kind of growing, and then like once the little chicks get big enough, they leave the nest and they go off and they're doing all their great stuff. And it's cool too because I guess there's another fellow, Armor Lord, who was saying that they were touching on this maybe in your earlier interview. But sure, a staple from you have a staple to draw from
Yep.
your prior work. Uh,
Absolutely. And here's something to think about too. And I think this was because of my comic book background. I think one reason our art has more impact is because the art is helping to present the world and tell the story. There are so many role playing games, especially in years past, where you'd open up the book and you'd find some beautiful page of art and you go, wow, this is awesome. What is it? Just a
right.
cool piece of art.
Right. And that's the another thing I'd like to say that I'm sort of lucky and privy to is every once in a while when we do talk, Kevin talks about the characters in the world. I hope he knows they're fiction, but he talks about them as if they're real, and he really knows how the story's progressing. He knows where it's been, where it's at right now, where it's going to be going, and I think maybe that approach to it seems to me the world is living and breathing essentially for you and you're always going through this process of constant changes and new things
It, it,
happening.
it is. And in fact, that kind of segues into, you know, the tabletop session and
Hmm.
game mastering, because that's true of my game too. I know you're going to ask some of these questions, so I
Hmm.
probably shouldn't jump the gun,
That's all
but
right, no problem.
the characters are alive and real for me, whether it's a villain or an NPC
Hmm.
or the one of the players' characters. Um, they're real in my head,
Mm.
and I feel like I know them, and that's how I can do a lot of improv, because I know what this villain is, I know what his alignment is, and whatever you throw at him, I know how he's going to react because I know that character.
So then is there with this kind of in mind, is there a game that like you look back on from many years ago that just still in your mind stands out? It might have been one that you GM'd. It might have been one that someone else GM'd. Is there something in particular that like just resonates maybe with you to this day, or something you talk about, like that time when this happened or that happened?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that's all gamers.
Yeah, that's okay. That's true.
and,
Guilty. It's
and,
true.
and yeah, there's lots of great moments. I was just recounting one the other day with Robotech and in skills where the in the heat of action, everyone's chasing down the bad guys. There was like this mole, they figured it out, and the guy jumps on a hover cycle and takes off, and they jump on a motor on a two of them jump into a Jeep, and they're zooming along, and they need to do, the guy's taking evasive action, and I'm like, so you guys are following him, right? And they're like, yeah, man, we're right on his tail. I'm like, great, roll for evasive maneuvers in under your piloting skill. And the one guy looks at the other guy, and the other guy looks at the other guy, and they're like, we don't have piloted ground vehicles. And so I have them just like ride right through the wall of some building, and they're in traction for the next 6 months. I had to roll up new characters. I didn't kill them, but they're just, because they just couldn't do the maneuver. I mean, I gave them an opportunity. I said, okay, roll, and they blew it.
Yeah.
So I mean, that was a great moment. There's a bunch of great adventures in my 3.5 year long Defiler campaign, and then in other games too. I one of the things I love is seeing how players react to stuff. Like I've been running this fantasy um, Halloween. It originally started out as a Halloween tournament for the Detroit Gaming Center, and I've run this thing, gosh, seriously, probably 100, 200 times
Yeah.
over the
Yeah.
last 40 years. And one of the things I enjoy from it is, first of all, I know it inside and out. I can do it without a sheet of paper in front of me. But I love seeing how different players and groups of players respond to the same thing. And I've run this thing so many times, I I don't expect to be surprised. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, every sixth or 10th game I run of it, someone surprises me.
Mm. What
Um,
this reminds me of what you, or this goes into my next question, because you mentioned the fact that these guys jump onto the hover cycle, they don't have a piloting skill. You have them ram, or they ram themselves into the wall. They're in traction for 6 months. Um, those are all like little decisions that we have to make as game masters on the fly, right? And sometimes game mastering can be like driving in some ways. You turn that wheel
yeah,
too fast one way or the other, and then you're stuck with your decision. I mean, obviously it's all fiction. You can always go back and
sure.
retcon it. But, if it's kind of fun to stick with what happens. How do you view the role of the game master, or perhaps just as maybe from your own point of view, how do you see your role as a game master? What does, what do you need to do? What do you absolutely need to do? Or maybe what should you absolutely not do?
That's a great question, and I don't know if there's one quick, simple answer to that. I mean, first of all, I think I do not view the game master as a them and us. I'm not trying to outsmart the players, and I'm not trying to kill them. I'm trying to facilitate the story. So I see myself more as a movie director
Hmm.
slash writer. So I have my plot, I have my villains, I know what our goal is, and that probably comes from having talked to the players and seeing what they would like to play or encounter and enjoy, and then I kind of roll with it. And like I said, I know the characters, so when one player says this or that to the villain, or one of the villains or his henchmen, I know how this guy, because I know his personality, I know how he thinks, how he's going to react. But yeah, I think really it's your job to help weave a great story. And I think, almost like acting again, you always hear, if you listen to actors talk, they always talk about, being in the moment and listening to your partner in the scene. And I think that applies to role playing. So I will always kind of riff off of what my players are doing or saying. And if, I had some very strong idea of where I want to take the story,
Mm.
that they say something or do something that takes it in another direction, I like to give them that illusion of freedom so they can go and do whatever they want. And at some point, we're going to get back around to, the big conflict or the big battle or whatever it is. Maybe not tonight's gaming session, maybe tomorrow, or next week's, or 3 weeks from now. But kind of let them run with things. My defilers did that to me when, well, I was always sort of an improv guy, and I loved working with, what the players kind of wanted. But what really got me into being very much more improvisational was in the early days. We're all 20 something maniacs, right? We're really into the gaming experience. And I would spend like 30, 40 hours hammering out my next adventure. Now,
Hmm.
granted, it's for 26 guys, and we play from 7 in the evening till 9 in the morning because we're crazy every Saturday. But
I'm going to ask you about this later, but keep going.
okay. And so they wanted to fight vampires and they wanted something really interesting. So I'm doing a dungeon crawl, basically, the Palladium of Desire. And level 4 is the Vampire Kingdoms. And it's the biggest, most elaborate level of the dungeon I have ever made.
Mm.
It's like double the size. It got all this detail. I'm ready to go. And one of those jerks says, "Hey, we're always going down into the dungeon. What's in the rest of the world?" And I'm like, "Okay, guys, that's right. Vampire Kingdoms. This is it." And Palladium of Desires was a mix of stuff. It was sort of a techno wizard complex. Not that I was calling it that then. And so, I mean, they're actually about to get into the elevator to go down to level 4. And another one of the players go, "Yeah, you're right. Why don't we see what's out there?" Bear in mind, I have no flipping idea
Right.
what's out there. Nothing. I mean, I know where they're located in the world and in the map, but I have no idea what's there. And ultimately, the whole group like mutinies and like, "Yeah, we want to go exploring out into the wilderness." I had to wing the whole adventure. And then it kept on going and going for weeks and weeks. And then they ended up going to another dimension and fought samurai trolls and orca ninjas. And it was awesome. I mean, we probably played out in the wilderness for 8 months, in this other dimension and all these different storylines before they came back. And by then they were so powerful they just ripped through level 4.
What does that make you nervous at all? Like when they throw you for we all know this as game masters that the players are going to throw you for a loop. Does it make you nervous or just like let's do it? And do you adapt material that you had prior and try to make it fit a bit or is it making their
I
expectations fit?
so when that happened, so the first time, when that happened, yeah, it made me nervous
Mhm.
because I don't know what's there. And again, I guess I'm an entertainer and a storyteller at heart. So
For
I
sure.
want them to have fun. When we get done with a game session, I want them to go, "Wow, that was awesome." Not, it was all right. So I want them to have fun. And I think that's sort of the responsibility of the game master. It gets back to the fact that this is a game, it's a
Yeah.
storyteller game. And the cool thing is we're making the story together.
Mhm.
So, and when they go off in directions I never imagined, I actually enjoy it. Early on, yeah, it made me a little made me a little
A little
nervous.
nervous. So on the other end, or on the other side of the coin, though, how do you see the role of the player? How is the player supposed to? What is the player supposed to do, or what is your ideal player?
I want my players to play in character. I want them to be that character. It's a role playing game. So
Hmm.
take that role and breathe some life into it.
Hmm.
Um, and then just kind of likewise, listen to what's going on and have fun with it and go with it and kind of riff with what's going on. It's that's the fun thing where it's like, okay, I kick open a door and I see whatever. There's a giant red dragon in there. Holy crap. Well, what are you doing? And I like to throw in some humor. So if the guy's like,
Mm.
holy crap, I'm standing there, I can't believe my eyes, I don't know what to do. I kind of run with that a little bit, where I turn to the rest of the group and I say, yeah, so and so open up the door and you see him standing there and he's just trembling like a leaf. And he turns around and he's all like pale and he's like, guys. And then I let him take it from there.
Yeah.
And it helps add a little bit of flavor. And maybe they're running away, maybe they're getting ready to attack the thing or talk. Someone, especially with a large group, someone will have a million different ideas. And I say, well, okay, so which one of the, you want to talk to it, you want to, blast it with your Cyclops, lightning bolt arrow. You guys want to run away and regroup. What the hell are you doing?
Hmm.
And then I roll with whatever they say they're doing.
And now on the opposite end of the spectrum, though, you mentioned like you'll spend hours and hours preparing
Well, I used to.
before you used to. So what did Kevin used to do to prepare for a game? Was there like a approach you had, or was it what did you do to kind of get yourself ready?
Well, in the early days before I started to really rely on improv, and I'm like almost total improv now, where I just kind of outline stuff, and I'll detail my main bad guy or three,
Hmm.
and then kind of outline their minions and make some notes on the treasure and stuff, and then I'm off to the races. In the early days, I would meticulously draw the map. If there was some new creature there they were going to encounter, I draw that, because it's always more fun when you say, okay, and now you see this,
Right.
and they go, holy crap, what the hell is that? You know. And being an artist, I had that advantage.
Hmm.
And I like to introduce things they weren't expecting, because in the early days we started out playing D&D, and then it kind of mutated into half D&D, half my own game system, and then turned into a completely my own game system. So if you say, oh, you're running into this common D&D monster or that one, they know what to expect. Oh, it's a bugbear, it's a this, it's a that, it's a knoll. They know what it is. But then you show them something they've never seen before, and they're like, what do we do? And I'm like, yeah, what do you do?
That's the situation that you kind of want them to be in, right? Because then, in a way, you're opening up an opportunity for them to contribute to the story. And now you can kind of step back and say, you know what, I've done my part. It's your turn now.
When a great example of players surprising you and just going with the flow. And I didn't mean to go here, but when I
Hmm.
used that red dragon analogy,
Hmm.
there was this the group needed to get a particular magical artifact from this dragon, and a dragon's reputation is the most fierce, terrible creature known to man. And uh and it does. When you see it, it just looks terrifying, and it's an adult dragon and whatever. And so the whole group is spending the whole week before the next adventure trying to plot this out. And one player comes to me and says, can we do a simple game session, before the group? I got an idea. And I'm like, yeah, sure. Let's see what happens. So he actually goes in all by himself to this dragon. And, the dragon is like, what are you doing here, human? How dare you interrupt me? And I don't even know how I got here. He said something, and the dragon's kind of cranky, and he says something like, well, you seem agitated. And he's like, I've got this terrible toothache, it's killing me. The guy says, and again, talk about riffing off each other.
Right.
The player says, well, what a coincidence, I'm a dentist. And I'm like, holy shit, where's this going?
Right.
And so the dragon's like, great. And he's like, well, so I'm here to kind of like, I just want to get this, artifact. I'm hoping we can maybe trade, or I could do a service for you, because he's really an assassin, right? And I think he was thinking, I get close enough, I try to kill this thing. And the dragon says, if you can fix my tooth, I'll give it to you. And, the guy looks at me like, really? How do I fix a dragon's tooth? And I said, well, the dragon invites you in, he opens his maw, and you can walk in and you see that there's this big, cavity. And he's like, oh man. And so he like scratches it out. He's like, I'm afraid this is gonna hurt. And he plays it his whole thing. He like putties it up with some freaking thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the dragon's like, that's great. You may take this now. Meanwhile, the rest of the group has got this big plan to
Right.
attack this thing and kill
Right.
this thing. And I set it up so that when we get together, the guy who just pretended to be a dentist has the artifact. He's ready to walk out. The rest of the group doesn't know it.
Has no
They
idea how
kick in
he.
the
Yeah.
door to attack the dragon. He's like, wait, wait, wait. But they won't listen. And so there's this battle. And it turned out the dragon was more show. It was sort of a Wizard of Oz kind of thing. The dragon was actually pretty weak, but he looked so dangerous.
It's interesting though that you're developing the character of the dragon, the NPC of the dragon, right? And you're sort of thinking it's going in one direction, and then an opportunity that your player brings up. With that, I would imagine you're kind of maybe making some switches on the fly to adjust
Oh
and
yeah.
adapt to the story itself. How do you go about like building a really like cool NPC? Do you go and sort of write out a bunch of like background for the character, or do you use your famous improvisational skills and just sort of make it up on the spot? Like, is there a difference between the you in the old days and the you now, or has that changed or evolved at all?
Yeah, I used to do really detailed characters, and sometimes I still do if I feel like it's important.
Mm-hmm.
And if I know ultimately this is going to be a big battle with the group. Again, my comic book sort of orientation is
Mm-hmm.
a lot of my big villains are, you know, Doctor Doom, the Joker, that kind of thing, Galactus.
Mm-hmm.
So I know the group as a team are going to have to fight this guy to win. Um, and So I might develop all of his powers and abilities. But otherwise, as long as I know what the character's alignment is,
Mm-hmm.
that because that kind of sets the whole stage, the way our Palladium's alignments are set up. It's very much the character's moral compass and how he kind of conducts himself. So if you know the alignment and you know his 8 attributes and any special abilities, you can go any direction you want to.
And then how would you go about setting, so if you have like your NPC here and you know that you have your players who have created certain characters over here, how do you go about maybe setting up an adventure scenario for them? Are there some sort of key points that you would try to cover? You mentioned how you outline sometimes these days, or like how do you highlight maybe the genre, or do you come up with like an adventure hook, or do you create a villain and then build the story around it, or is it some kind of combination of all of those
Yeah, it's
things?
a combination of all those. It kind of depends on the situation. So, for example, like when they ran off into the woods and I had no idea what's out there,
Mm-hmm.
one of the characters was supposed to be a witch hunter. So he's like, I hope we run into witches. And I'm like, oh, yeah, and I don't have anything prepared. I don't know. So in my head, I kind of, and while they're talking and doing stuff, tromping through the woods, I'm making notes, diabolic evil.
Right.
I'm flipping through the book and thinking, okay, she's got this spell and that spell and blah, blah, blah. And other times, I have a more formal adventure, like it's a returning villain, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to surprise them when he shows up with his minions, and they're like, "Oh, so it's you guys," and how, depending on how they react to him, if they
Yeah.
attack him immediately, it's going to be a big battle. If they say, "Oh, well, just we're going to ignore the guy, or we're going to keep our eye on him, or maybe they see him from a distance." And again, for me, it kind of depends what's going on. I might say, okay, Matthew, what is your character doing? Well, I'm going to the bar, and I might decide, okay, that's where you see him. You see him and some other guy, looks like he's royalty, talking just outside the bar. What are you doing? Well, I'm gonna hang back, or maybe I'm sneaking forward to see if I can eavesdrop and see what they're saying. And then maybe it's like afterwards, after the two guys split,
Mm.
one member of the group might say, okay, I'm going to follow this guy. And the other one's going to say, I'm going to follow the guy, the villain we hate and know. And then, those lead to different things, but they may all be related to whatever plot I have in mind. These guys are here to take over the town, or they're looking for the same artifact that our heroes are looking for, or our heroes are here to hunt down some horrible villain, um, to help the town people out. But these guys are in town because the horrible villain is hiring them
Hmm.
as his henchmen. It kind of all depends on where things are going to go.
And as you're sort of running the players through the game and sort of responding to them, I was wondering, do you have when I play with Kevin the game master, am I playing with a do you have a game mastering voice, or are you essentially yourself? And then the follow up to that would be, how do you handle, because I can tell just from interviewing you a couple times and talking to you a few times outside of this, that you do voices in your everyday life anyway. Do you switch between NPC voices? So I guess my first question is, do you have a certain sort of voice for yourself as game master, and then do you switch and move around between NPC voices?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the NPC and how much fun I'll have with it. So
Hmm.
yeah, as the game master, I'm more or less myself, and I more or less use my tone. So you're gaming with Kevin,
Hmm.
but then when you run into a particular character, um, yeah, I don't always. So I'll describe the character if it's a first time meeting, and then it's not. Sometimes I do voices, and other times I'll just kind of take an attitude, like, "Oh, please move, rabble," and right
Mm.
away it helps establish that this guy's a noble and he's an arrogant dick, you know, and and, and the words you choice as well as the voice. And other times, if I'm playing a wolfen or a troll, they're gonna have that kind of a voice. And then one of my favorite characters I like to drop in because he just annoys everybody, and I have a blast with him. Is especially, well, when I'm playing fantasy, anyways, is Pinch the Goblin. Yeah, and Pinch talks like this. And Pinch always has some scheme. Like, oh, I would never steal that purse. It dropped down. Here you go. Here's it back. You should give me a reward for finding your purse. And they know damn well he stole it
Right.
and failed his role. And it's like, hey, what are you doing? Oh, I found this for you. Um,
You do have those voices. That's something to hear. I've never heard that before. So do you have like a recurring when you run your campaigns, you might have like a recurring cast of NPCs and stuff in the background?
Sometimes,
Mm.
again, it kind of depends on the situation and the setting. And then other times I might just kind of describe, like if it's a female character, I don't necessarily try to do a female voice
Mm-hmm.
because that's hard.
Yeah.
Uh, but I might again kind of, cop a tone where, hi, handsome,
Right.
you know, oh, are you a paladin? I love paladins, I played little girl, as a game master, I played everything.
Right. Yeah, we've
Uh,
we've all I think we've all done that. And there are moments like where I sort of look around the table and I think about what we're all doing as adults. And it's really nice to see in a way, like because I see this, so those of you that watch my channel, and Kevin knows this, I'm a teacher, so I work with children all the time. And I see this joy in pretending to be something other than you are. And I think as we become adults, sometimes we forget that there is joy in it and there's nothing wrong and it's a lot of fun. But I often look
it
around
is
the
fun.
table and I'm like, it's great that I have like a group of friends that we can like do this with. Um, so going in the opposite direction now, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned before because this has a lot to do with my next question. You had casually and quickly sort of said you were running a game for 26 players. Now, I remember when we talked last time in my our last interview, you had mentioned something similar, that you had like a huge game going. Is that literally all at the same time, or is it like a game where you play with 6 or 7 one week and then 6 or 7 another? Okay. All
No,
right. That's what I thought.
it was 26 guys all at the same time.
How do you manage? And this is something that if you can explain, like if you can do, if you can play with
I
26
can.
players, you can play with 5 or 6 and it's no sweat. For the average mortal playing with the mortal game master, playing with 5 or 6 players, how would you recommend they go about balancing so that everybody kind of sort of feels or managing the table? How would you do
Well,
that?
well, that's where, I mean, again, that's sort of the job of the game master to kind of pay attention and try to give everybody's moment to shine. And sometimes that's hard because some players are very overt and they're happy to jump into that role and they take on a voice and an accent and
Mm.
I'm Lord so and so,
Yeah,
thy has offended me or whatever, and
right.
that's great. And other guys are like, so what are you doing? And it's like, I'm standing guard.
Yeah.
Okay. Or and there was this one guy in particular who I wasn't even sure he was enjoying the games because he was so quiet. And um I kept trying to throw things at him like, yeah, you hear a rustling in the bushes. I wake up the paladin and the ranger and let them know. And it's like that was his opportunity to go and investigate, but nope. And then it's like, yeah, there's a voice in your head. It's you realize it's probably someone reaching out to you, something reaching out to you telepathically. I alert the rest of the group that there's a danger. And I'm like, oh my God, you know, I, I would be like, yeah, the group is all doing this. And you notice a shadowy figure. I call out to the group and say, look, there's a shadowy figure. And I'm like, ay, and then, and I felt bad because I felt like he never had his moment to shine.
Mm.
And then, there was finally some incident. Well, first of all, I think he needed 8, 10 games to feel comfortable enough
Yeah.
to start playing a character.
Yeah.
And I would ask him after these early games where I feel like the poor guy is getting nothing to do. I would say, are you okay? Are you having fun? And he's like, yeah, the game's great. And I'm like, okay. Um, so you got to be aware of that. You also have to be aware that some people, especially if you're playing with new players, they might not
Hmm.
necessarily understand the dynamic. I played with a young lady who was quite smart and well read. And again, this is my fantasy game. We're playing like this little side game introductory thing for her and her couple of friends. And she could not, and it's the only time I ever really ran into this. She could not differentiate between the character and herself. So she's playing an elf trying to buy some weapons and armor from a dwarf, and they hate each other. So he's calling her a bitch and stuff, and she gets
Hmm.
upset, like, why are you calling me a bitch?
Hmm.
And I'm like, who, me? I'm not calling you a bitch.
Right.
I like you a lot, Susan.
Right.
And it's like, no. And I explained to her as a character. She's like, oh, okay. And then it's like, she knows the dwarf is giving her a bad deal. And she's like, well, why are you ripping me off? He just sold to the other dwarf the same weapon for half the price. And I'm like,
Mm.
because he's a dwarf and he hates
How
elves.
how do you deal with like because there is a learning curve for a lot of people because it takes some time. I've introduced RPGs to lots of people, and there are different ways maybe, or there are different people that take it in different ways. How do you introduce an RPG to someone that's maybe never played for the first time? Do you just say, okay, let's just follow along with what we're doing and do your best, and or do you explain it to them to begin with, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, I give him a general explanation of how it all works, and like there have been a lot of times like at conventions
Hmm.
where rather than have them roll up their own character, like especially I'm running like a tournament kind of thing, they get pre-rolled characters,
Mm.
and I kind of explain the setting, a quick explanation of the setting, a little bit about the character. Make sure you notice, so and so you're playing a wizard, you're playing a wolfen. Here's some of the dynamics, and I kind of try to bring them in, and then they've got the character sheet to read. And then you just kind of go slow and let them run with it. I find most people, especially kids,
Mm.
pick it up like that. And adults have actually more trouble with it when they're introduced to role playing than kids do. Um, and kids pick up things lightning fast,
Mm.
and a half hour into it, they're into their character, they're into the situation. They're ready to kick some ass. And kids are violent, especially little kids.
Yeah.
People are, yeah, they're always like, oh, they're so sweet and innocent, and it's like, so what is your character doing? I'm clipping him in half. And
Yes,
it's like, you don't even know for sure he's a bad guy. Well, he said he's an orc,
it's
or
true.
whatever. And it's like,
Yeah.
Uh,
At that age, they don't see the textures that maybe as adults. It's interesting, like how that sort of works. Like kids get into it more, adults are slower to get into it, but then the kids have the simpler solutions, and you kind of work them
yep,
towards more textured stuff. But eventually, the adults will start. Well, they'll start with those textured solutions,
yep.
and maybe in some ways that's what makes it kind of difficult for them. How do you think that like a good player and a good game master can maybe support each other in their roles? Is there anything that they're kind of doing? Is there some sort of something going on between a good player and game master?
I think a good player will ask good questions and leading questions, especially if one of their fellow players is clearly not quite on the same page. They might say, "So Kevin, are you saying this or that?" And I'll be like, "No, I'm trying to say this." And you see the light bulb go up above the other
Mm,
guy's head. And then helping to move the story along, because that's the real trick, I think, to a good game is the pacing. If it gets slow and bogged down and lost in minutia,
hmm.
and I've played in a few games like that with game masters. I'm like, how long are we going to be buying equipment and going to the brothel?
Right.
I want some action. Give me something.
Right.
And that's why also a game master tip. If nothing's going to happen on the journey to wherever you're getting, and I don't care what
Yeah.
game you're playing, fantasy, riffs, Robotech, fast forward.
Yeah.
Yep, it's 5 hours later. You ran into no problems. You're at the town, you're at the village, or you're at the base, or whatever the heck it is. We don't need to have that slogging journey if nothing's going to happen.
So in a way, so as a game master, you're sort of editing the story in your head on the fly
Absolutely.
as it's going, right? So again, there's that sort of director analogy that you were using before. Do you think it's possible, or do you think it's good or bad or something else? Do you think, how do you feel about directing a player? Is that a possibility? Maybe to sort of steer them along or help them out a little bit?
Yeah, personally, I'm a big fan of non-player characters. I always early on introduce an NPC into most groups. Not so much in tournament games because people are more focused and they know this is only going to last 2, 3, 4 hours and they need to be more on point. But in an ongoing campaign, I like to introduce an NPC to help move the story along and help point them in the right direction. Sometimes I find that very effective. The trick is not leading them by the hand and not forcing them into situations. One of my favorite NPCs with the Defilers was a character called Fearless, and Fearless was a paladin, at least in his own mind. He wasn't a paladin at all. He could prove he was a paladin though because he had this certificate that he couldn't read that said he was a paladin that he paid 50 gold for,
Mm-hmm.
and Fearless was actually a stoner. So, but he was truly fearless and had the heart of a paladin.
Mm.
So when a group would sometimes be, you know, having trouble making a decision or it got a little bogged down, there's this one time in a tavern where the group is just dicking around and I'm getting bored and I'm like, yeah, you see this arrogant knight bothering one of the barmaids, and the group was like, oh well, and it's funny, they're all really good guys, right? I mean, their characters are all heroes, and they're like, well, I don't know, it's none of our business. How do we? And Fearless just steps up and is like, you lout, unhand, that woman, and of course the guy is one of the villains they're going to be fighting with later. And he's like, who the hell are you? You stay out of my business. And he's like, no, this woman clearly does not want your affections. And, and now this guy's going to fight Fearless, and Fearless
Mm.
is outclassed. Now the
Mm.
rest of the group has to go, oh, shit. And a few of the characters come in like, don't mess with our friend, buddy. And right away, we're also setting the stage for when they run into this guy later. They're like, oh, crap. you know, and if it has that sense of continuity,
Right. Right.
um,
It
and
sounds.
Fearless was, being a stoner, he was also clumsy. So the group would be trying to be, there were times that are trying to be stealthy.
It sounds
And
like it's a good blend of all of those good things that you were kind of
yeah,
talking about before. Like you're taking a little bit of direction here, you're taking a little bit of on the fly, making stuff up, improvisation. Then you have a little bit of stuff that you have
but
like thought
then
about
I would
before.
let them kind of decide what that conflict was going to be, how far
Yes.
they're going to take it. Fearless would step back, or he'd get pushed away, and I'd have him, maybe get knocked out, so that the group could take it from there. He just kind of helped set things up and move things along a little bit.
So then with that kind of in mind, you mentioned the idea that so to me it sounds like what you're describing is you're setting up this scenario where there's going to be like sparks of conflict or sparks of action on the part of the player. Now, I don't know if this is something, and I never know what is and isn't true when I sort of read it online. But I had read a lot online about you being a person that uses a lot of house rules and home rules and things like that. Is there any truth to that? Do you use a lot of house rules, and if so, um, do they enhance? Are you doing this to enhance the gameplay somehow, or are you adapting it to like what's going on with your specific group?
Yeah, so I think part of it is I don't know, with my own game system, I don't really think of myself as having a lot of house rules.
Oh yeah, that's
I think the difference is I I know the rules well, and I know
uh-huh.
what's going in my head.
Uh-huh.
So I don't throw rules in the face. I don't stop the action and say,
Right.
how far away are you? In my mind, I kind of know where the characters are.
Mm-hmm.
And you know
Mm-hmm.
what? If he's 10 feet out of range, but it's going to be dramatic, if he can pull his weapon,
Yeah.
I'm going with the flow. I'm not going
Yeah.
to stop and say, oh, shucks, you're 2 feet out of range.
Right.
So
Yeah.
nothing. It's like, come on, we've got this action going. I always look at rules as kind of being like a modern automobile. I don't know jack about cars or mechanics or electronics or anything. I want a vehicle that I go in, as long as it has gas, I put my key in, I turn it, and it goes.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of my philosophy with gaming. I just want it to go, and it's all about character and story.
Mm-hmm.
So I try not to bog it down with obvious rules. There are times from time to time where I'm casting a spell, and the guy kind of got it wrong. It doesn't quite work that way, but mostly. And so I go with the flow. And I think later afterwards they go, wow, you don't really, play by your own rules. And I'm like, yeah, I do. I just don't, I'm not rules heavy, and I don't
Yeah.
throw it in your face. And there are times, I don't remember half the stuff I've written. So if someone
Mm-hmm.
says I'm using something I don't recall, I'm like, hold on. And I pull up my
let me
book.
let me check the book.
Yeah, exactly.
I wrote that. What? I totally believe it though. I mean, you've got a massive you got a massive portfolio of work. It's you can I'm sure you can be forgiven for forgetting some rules here and there. Um
And then as far as like other games, to me, I always try to be flexible.
mhm,
And I recognize the fact, and why I always encourage people to use house rules if
mm,
they don't like something in my game or someone else's game, because role playing is very personal.
mm,
So if something doesn't work for you, I don't care what game system it is, and you want to take a patch from some other game system or something you came up yourself, or you think this enhances the gaming experience and your group loves it,
mhm,
I'm all for it. Go for it.
mhm.
Whatever works for you and your players.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I totally think that's great. And I think it also kind of shows just in your approach to like your products and things like that. And I think you've actually you mentioned that in a lot of the books that you've written and you've sort of said that in outright, that that's a really important part. And what's interesting about reading your books is that they often they have a little there's a bit of a personal voice behind them, which I find to be very comfortable. And it probably ties back into the idea of you being close to your fans and you being so passionate about what you do, and then you kind of like wanting to wanting to give the people that use your products the agency to sort of and license to sort of make some changes for their own table if they want
Right.
to. How do you feel about one thing I've kind of thought about in retrospect in all these years is, and maybe it's also just me because in recent years I've been using a lot. of minis and tiles and things like that. I was wondering if you ever brought minis and tiles. I know that you mentioned obviously doing a lot of drawing and like you sort of like you visualize a lot of the stuff, but have you ever used minis and tiles in your games, or how do you feel about that?
I have no problems with them. I know a lot of people do, and especially these days, it seems like more and more, both virtually and physically, people are using maps and tiles and
Hmm.
miniatures. For me, personally, I tend to be more of a role-playing purist,
Hmm.
but I also have the advantage of I can throw down a piece of paper and draw
Yes.
more or less like you're here, these are trees, this is a rock, this
Yeah.
is it's important sometimes. For me, it's like whatever makes your gaming experience better, use it. We may move into those directions as well. Pinnacle has done a lot of great maps, and they got a lot of different kinds of representations for the characters, both virtually and physically, on the tabletop. So, and the industry is kind of moving. Again,
That's true.
times
Yeah.
change people's appeals. So there was a time when role players and miniature players were like two different things. If you dared to imply one was close to the other, they would punch you in the nose. And and now I think because of miniatures are so prevalent because they're inexpensive to print in China,
Mm.
at least until the pandemic, and people are more visually oriented now. I think because of card games and board games and video games. So I think they like to have that, and it's cool to have your figure
Yeah.
there representing where he is, what he is, and especially in a lineup where your group is moving and doing things, it's nice to help people who aren't as visually oriented understand what's going on, where their character is, and perspective of everything else that's happening.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think they're great tools.
I think so as well because I remember like every so often and probably every game master has this moment like every game master maybe that is a little bit more into theater in the mind and using description you'll say something like oh well you're only 5 feet away and then you realize that there's some discrepancy between what they visualize and what you visualize and then there's a moment where you're kind of like talking trying to figure out what happened and then I personally just give
Right.
my players the benefit of the doubt but it kind of just brought up in my mind this idea
Yeah.
that boy there are situations where minis can be very valuable and
Yeah.
tiles can be really good for plotting that out what can you tell me something maybe for our final question for this part two? Is there something about your game mastering style that you feel has changed or evolved over the years? Like, is there something that you would have done 20 or 30 years ago that maybe you don't think you do now, or vice versa?
I think we kind of talked about it, my moving more and more towards improvisation. You give me a couple character stats and a subject, and I can run a whole game for the next 3 hours. So I've gotten much, much, much more comfortable and capable of doing that. Um,
To
but
what I
go
was going to
ahead.
say to what, because this is a really like big question, I think, for a lot of people. Because there are people that just sort of throw it out and say, "Oh, I improvise a lot more." To what do maybe you attribute your skills with improvisation? Like, where do you think that grew out of?
Um,
Just simple experience over the years, or was it something else?
I tend to be kind of analytical and see the big picture, so it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
easy for me. I think having gamed a ton, especially with 26 guys, that believe
Mm-hmm.
me, that keeps you on your toes.
Yeah.
Um, and it's just comfortable for me. It's my gaming style.
Mm.
Someone else may need something much more rigid and much more visual. Um, and that's okay. Just because I am big into
Mm-hmm.
improv doesn't mean if you don't improv at all means that you're a lousy game master. No, you're probably a great game master. It's just a different style, different approach. That's what I mean about role playing is very
Yeah.
personal for everybody. The one thing I do want to say, because I
Mm-hmm.
found this very valuable, again, especially with large groups, like since the defilers, I usually don't play with. Well, there's been a few times where I've run 20 or more people, but um, um, I typically play with 8 to 14 people, which is a lot more manageable, but still a lot. That's more than a lot of game masters would ever consider
Mm.
running. What I like to do at the end of my games, which I found very, very expected, helpful, especially for the players, is I'll do sort of a recap.
Mm-hmm.
And in that recap, I point out that, Matt, when you made that decision, that was awesome. And, Wayne, when jumped the bad guy from behind and he didn't expect it, that was brilliant. And holy crap, when you rolled those 2 20s, natural 20s in a row, man, and so kind of point out some of the things they did to make them feel good.
Mm-hmm.
And then also to give them a little background, like, man, it was a good thing, Matthew, that you nailed that
Right.
guy when you did, because what you didn't know was he was planning to do this, or he was about to do that. And because of your deft action or pure luck in some cases, you prevented what could have been something horrible, or catastrophic to the group. And it just helps bring it all kind of together and to life.
Yeah, that's a really good idea because then it kind of sparks all new directions and ideas for the players to kind of rebound and go off in. So if that's done at the beginning or the end of the game, or maybe even who knows both, that idea. And I found too that when I do that, sometimes it's a good way of kind of like retconning some things that I wish hadn't happened, or maybe I want a detail I want to tweak. But I also find, like just like you said, I think it's a really great way of tying everything together.
Yep.
Um, well, speaking of tying things together, we've just finished up part two of Through the Rifts. So Kevin's been talking here about his advice for those of us at the table. We're going to take a short 10-minute intermission during which everybody's going to kind of like re-energize, maybe drink some Jolt Cola or something just to give us that final push to get us through the final part of tonight's discussion. If you like what you're watching, you can help me out by liking and subscribing, but maybe more importantly, so you can support me in getting other creators on, like Kevin. If you want to share this, that would be great. That would help me out tremendously. I am going to throw up an intermission countdown. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to refresh ourselves, but we will be back in 10 minutes for part three, the final part of Through the Rifts. We'll be right back. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are back for the final part of Through the Rifts for tonight with Kevin. And the first part, of course, we were talking a little bit about or a lot about the history of Palladium. In our second part, we were talking about Kevin's experiences at the table and his advice for game masters and ideas to improve their game. In this third part, final part, through the rifts, Kevin is going to share with us some of his thoughts and ideas on world and setting building. And with that in mind, let's just get started, Kevin. When you're starting out with a new idea, do you kind of worry about? And we'd mentioned the bigger narrative of course, the Megaverse and all that. Do you worry about it fitting the greater narrative, or are you just like, oh, this is a great idea, I'm going to run with it? Or are you like a big picture sort of guy that like looks at how it fits into the whole puzzle, and then
Yeah,
how do you approach that?
I tend to be more of a big picture guy, but sometimes you just get an idea and you run with it. Um, it kind of depends where the inspiration hits. A great example, and guys waiting for CS Manhunters won't be happy to hear this, but I was hot as hell writing Riff's Manhunter, and I
Hmm.
often say that I sometimes feel like, especially when I'm hot, I feel like the ideas aren't even my own; that they're like
Yeah,
being beamed into me
yeah.
from an alien spacecraft, and I have to write it down as fast as I can before the transmission ends. And I'm writing away on Manhunters. I'm really hot, and all of a sudden, something triggered all these ideas for magic spells for Beyond the Supernatural. Because I'm supposed to be doing Tome Grotesque and Beyond Arcanum as well. I mean, books that are way, way, way late.
Hmm.
They keep getting postponed for one reason or another, and I just had to stop, and I spent like 6 hours just making notes and then going back, and I flushed out two or three of the spells, and which are really cool, by the way. And I had to. It was just there, and I had to do it before the transmission ended.
Is
Um,
there, so are you kind of following that inspiration and trying to catch it before it kind of flies away, or is
yes.
that kind of like your approach to?
So what I do is, like, there are also times, like right now I live like 5 minutes from my house, 6 minutes. So, but when we were in Taylor, it was a 25-minute to 40-minute drive, depending on weather and traffic. And there were times where I always kept a notepad with me all the time, because there were times I would have to pull over
Hmm.
because your mind just kind of wanders. It's mindless driving down the
Right,
freeway, and then
right.
it's like, oh wait, there's this great idea or a great name for a creature or a
Yeah,
spell or a power, and I'd have to drive down to jot it down before it's gone. You would think you would remember stuff. There's been lots of times where I'm half asleep and I'm thinking,
yeah.
I'll remember this. It's great. And when you wake up in the morning, it's gone. Or by the time you get home from that drive, it's gone. So yeah, so I get the idea down first and I run with the inspiration. And then I go back to it and say, how do I fit this into the bigger picture? How am I going to develop this? If the idea even fits at all. Sometimes it's a great idea, but and it was fun writing it, but it slows down the pacing or
Or so will you like
imbalances.
just sort of toss it out, or because like that's, I think this is something that I think is important for budding creators, burgeoning
Oh
like
yeah.
creators. Like a lot of times those ideas are so precious, and maybe so rare perhaps in the beginning because you're still trying to like get your footing as a creator, that you tend to put, you put a lot into each one. For you though, I assume that you've got lots of ideas and you have to know maybe how to step away from some of them sometimes.
Yeah, well, yeah, two things. I mean, sometimes you just have to kill your babies, as Winston Churchill, I think, said. It doesn't matter how good it is if it screws everything up. Sure, maybe it was pure genius, but
Hmm.
in the bigger context, it just messes everything up. You got to toss it out. Now, the cool thing is You're not actually balling up a piece of paper and throwing it in the garbage.
Yeah.
You just put it in a file, and maybe you're going to use that in your next game or 5 years from now. Um, so they're not really gone and they're not really wasted. Um, they're just taken and put aside if they don't quite fit or work.
Mm. Are there any particular pillars of world building for you? So, for example, when you sit down and you get the idea for a new Rifts like world book or a new setting, like, and you want to go to a particular corner of the Earth, or off the Earth, actually, for that matter. Are there some beats that you kind of try to hit, or are you just, again, you're sort of following your inspiration along?
It's sort of a little bit of both. Like in the case of a new setting, especially a real world setting, I'll put aside a lot of time to just read about that place and draw inspiration from its history, its myths and legends. Because no place, most places have very rich histories and legends and monsters and things that you can draw from, whether you actually call it that or you make it something new, but it's inspired by this or that. That was especially true in all the China books we've ever written. But even Palladium Fantasy, when I first did Palladium Fantasy, my first big, full, fleshed out game, I must have read 200 books on, mythological beings, fairies, witchcraft, supposed witchcraft,
Hmm.
um, voodoo, all kinds of different magics. I wanted to make my magic system different. I had the traditional spells and then circles and wards and all that stuff, summoning. And much to my disappointment, real so-called real magic, um, especially old stuff. It's funny. I look at some of these books on Wicca and stuff now, and they're a little bit more dynamic. But if you look at the old traditional stuff, so-called magic was really, really boring. It's not movie magic,
Right.
where you're summoning up a demon and opening up
Yeah.
a rift like you
Yeah.
do in a game.
Yeah.
It's how do you cure cowlick? How do you charm someone to love you or get them to notice you or protect you from, evil spirits is about as exciting as it got. It's all pretty pedestrian. It's all about, curing illnesses and
Yeah.
heartbreak and, finding success and that kind of thing. And it's like, well, this is no good in a game.
Right. Right. How do you then, so if it sounds like what you're doing is you're starting off with like some foundational research in order, and like you're saying, it's probably particularly true for your books that sort of build off of real historical events or places and all of that. So you're starting off with that and you're building off of that. Um, how do you start to make it like how do you start to make it more interesting then? So if you're looking up real magic, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is kind of boring. Like, is there a process you go through, or is there something you do in order to like, I'm gonna make this, give this more oomph and make it more rifts like, or make it more beyond the supernatural like, or does it sort
Yeah,
of?
absolutely. So when I was in high school, I took, I don't remember, it was a whole year or semester of journalism. And this, by the way, applies to game masters and creating characters and adventures too. Is in journalism, they tell you, ask questions: why, when,
Hmm.
where, how. Um, and I do that all the time. And another thing for me, what's really important, because role playing games are science fiction or fantasy or science fantasy. You want what I consider to be the wow factor.
Hmm.
So here's the pedestrian version. What can I do to make it wow
Yeah.
people when they read it or go, ooh, I never thought of it that way, or I never thought of it at all. What and obviously, since we're making games, is in the context of how does this enhance your character, how does this enhance the setting, the adventure, et cetera, et cetera. And then with characters and settings, like if I'm creating a good guy organization or an evil organization, I try to think about the ramifications and the consequences of if, and this is especially true in your games.
Mm-hmm.
It drives me crazy when I'm talking to a game master who says, "Yeah, I don't know what to do. My players ran in and you know they killed the sheriff and the
Yeah.
deputy and they did all these horrible things." And I'm thinking, these are good guys. What's the consequence?
Right.
I mean, then it's like, well, there was none. You know, they're powerful guys, and I'm like, but you know, your heroes are the kind of guys who are hired to fight and bring to justice guys just like what you just said your character group did. So
Yeah.
there should be some NPC group that somebody reaches out to because you killed my father or my brother or wiped out my whole freaking family.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's got to be consequences. So who is that? You know, when are they coming for you? What do they have that makes you you know, will be a threat to you? There's all these questions and consequences of the action. So one thing leads to another. If you do this, um, is going to have this, you know, this range of consequences. You know, the defilers, it was funny, you know, they're all like 10th and 11th level characters. And one day, you know, the group's like, "Hey, Kev, we're these really powerful guys, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Well, why are we always getting their asses kicked? Why are these guys always hunting us down?" And I'm
Right.
like, because when they're thinking we want to take over the world or do this terrible thing, it's like, oh, the defilers will come after us, so we need to take them down first. And they're like, oh, and that was just a consequence
Right.
of their reputation
Right.
for being these fantastic, powerful heroes. Every major bad guy went, well, we're going to have to deal with them sooner or later, you know,
Yeah,
and
it's
so,
interesting that
you
you
know,
say this because it links back to what you were saying about running the table and the consequences that come from the characters doing things. And I see maybe Kevin, the game designer or the setting designer, who's also thinking about, well, there's maybe you're sort of seeing things like I see things in terms of like two things, like players moving about and then the interaction of the landscape around them. And it sounds like something that other people miss is the landscape, but you are like always thinking about that landscape and that idea. So, how do you then go about forming these ideas into words on a page? Do you have like a particular approach to actually writing, sitting down and doing it? Do you follow that inspiration again, or does writing become more like a job? Which one would you, or is it both? Maybe.
it's really both. Like, so it's easy to write when you're inspired. When you're hot, what I call dynamo mode, you're
Hmm.
just pounding away and everything is golden, whether it is or not, by the way.
Yeah.
And but in the heat of the moment, this is awesome, and you just kind of pound away, and then there's some point where that inspiration leaves, and sometimes it does. Sometimes it turns into a grind. So how I avoid the grind is always trying to find what's fun or challenging about whatever it is I'm working at. So that makes it more fun. And then I'm always, like I said, I'm always looking for the wow factor. I'm always thinking about,
Hmm.
well, how's my audience going to respond to this? What are they going to think of this? And there's been lots of times where I write something up and I'm like, it's just too flat or
Yeah.
it's too similar to something else. And, you know, so I toss it out or put it aside. Um, you know, it's like when I'm setting out to start a book or a particular chapter, I often do a very simple outline
Hmm.
of what I want. I want these six monsters or villains. And then as I'm writing some of those, yeah, the inspiration may come again. And I'm like, oh, if I'm creating this, it should have this opposing thing or this complementary thing, or this creature doesn't have, or villain doesn't have this, but I'm going to make something that does.
Right.
And you know, you kind of go where it takes you. And then the hardest part, it's funny, I was talking to Sean Robertson about this, is that the hardest part for me and a lot of my writers is trying to decide what doesn't go in the book. Because you can write and write and write and write. I mean, if
Yeah.
you've got an active imagination,
Yeah.
you know, that book could be 900 pages, but it can't be because it's not economically feasible. It's too much for any one person to read in one big clump. So then you have to think about, okay, I'm going to take this cool batch of ideas and I'm going to make it a source book or a follow-up book of some kind, or an adventure book, or I'm just putting it aside for some other project.
When
You
you,
gotta kind of have to edit yourself.
well, I was going to say, when you sit down to work on a project, do you and ultimately decide to go forth with it, are you thinking, okay, this book is going to be a certain number of pages long? Oh, so you've kind of got that idea in mind, and now you're going to write to fit that. Is that kind of correct?
Pretty much, although that's only so effective. Great example is Rip CS Manhunters was supposed to be a 96 or 128 page book. And I think I'm going to have trouble cramming it into 192 or 224, because ideas just kind of, and that's the thing is some books, it's funny, some books you just pound out, like Atlantis. It was like all in my head, ready to go.
Yeah.
And I sat down. I think I wrote that book in 3 or 4 weeks, and it went from just A to Z.
Yeah.
And it was epic. And then other books kind of take on a life of their own. And while that's often good, sometimes it makes you reconsider everything and that's what happened with Riff's Manhunter, is I had this one thought, and then it just kind of spun into other things, which ultimately is making it a superior product. People are going to love this thing. In fact, a great example of that is, in my mind, it was just about the Manhunters and maybe dog boys and kill hounds, who are sort of the minions and henchmen. Um, and then it kind of expanded into, here's coalition society, which
Hmm.
bizarrely enough, after 30 years, we've never really gotten a really clear picture of that. So you get to understand the role dog boys play in that society, and what the people think about, the military, and how they behave, and how they're really happy to be in a fortified city because there's nothing but danger and monsters and villains all around them. And so the fact that the coalition tends to be very aggressive towards non-humans and mages, whether they're truly villains or not, the citizens don't really give to anything. They don't care, because I'm safe, I'm happy, my world is stable. We're going to kind of turn a blind eye to what the coalition army does outside our walls. Um,
So,
and I didn't expect any of that. And likewise, I thought I was going to have like 10, 12, 15 new psionic abilities, and it turned into 53, not counting the special abilities that
right.
each of the manhunters have.
Yeah. Yeah. So this makes me wonder then. So at a certain point, the megaverse becomes so big that perhaps it cannot even be contained. You're going to have to call in other people to help you out in order maybe to expand it.
Oh, yeah.
Now, of course, you're used to collaborating with people. Like as a game master, you have to sort of naturally be a collaborator
Yep.
in order to make something work. What was it like, or what is it like bringing people on? Do people come to you and they say, "I have a great idea," or do you like say, "Oh, I've got a great idea, but I have 17 other great ideas. I need somebody to write this great idea for me," and you call them up and ask them to work? How does that process work?
Sort of both. I think more often than not, it's people who come to me and say, I have a great idea. Can I run with it? Or here's a great idea. Do you want to run with it? Um, that's probably the majority, at least up to this point.
Hmm.
I think that'll be changing the way we're trying to set things up. And then, even now and in the past, there were people I would call up depending on who they were, like Bill Coffin or Eric
Hmm.
Wujcik, and these days, Matthew Clements or Carl Gliba or Mark Oberly. I'll call them up and I say, I got this great idea, but what do you think? And then they'll shoot out some ideas, and I'll say, hey, do you wanna write that section? Or send me your ideas, because I really like what you're saying. Um, so, like, for example, Garden of the Gods, I had this great idea, was just kind of sitting there forever. And I had told Matthew about it, and he's like, Kev, you want me to write it? And I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. Same thing of Land of the Damned. It's another thing that he said, you want me to take a run at it? And I'm like, yeah, please do. And guys like Matthew Clements, I know I can just let run with it. and then I'll get their manuscript, and then I'll add the stuff I want in there, or stuff that I think they went off base. Like Matt at some point kind of got how the garden worked wrong, and so I had to toss that part out and
Hmm.
rewrite stuff. And then also he had, all these forgotten gods, and the problem is, Matt's not really used to working on books in that nature. He's more of a He wants to be a novelist, well, actually, he wants to be a
Hmm.
screenwriter, and is making some impressive moves towards that end. So the first like 10 gods were really well defined, and he broke it down. He had this nice little template that
Mm.
I look at and go, wow, this is brilliant.
Mm.
This is great. But after a while, like each god had, a special holy weapon or two or three, and then they had a blessing or two or three, and some other stuff. And then by like the 12th god, because Matt's not as experienced, he was running out of steam. So it'd be like one
Right.
weapon, and then it started to turn into, blessings and artifacts unknown. And I'm like, you can't do that,
Yes.
especially when you have this dynamic opening where people are going to read this and go, wow, this is great. And then what? The next 20 gods have nothing.
Hmm.
I mean, you can't do that. You already set up expect, and you got to be aware of that as a writer or a publisher. Set something up, you got to follow through.
Right. And so I take it then, because it sounds like obviously if I come to you with an idea, or if some writer comes to you with an idea, and they are wet behind the ears, they're starting out, then you're kind of taking a look at the overall big picture. So not just the way that it fits into, the bigger Palladium Megaverse picture, but also what you're delivering in terms of like playable content maybe, or balanced
Yes.
content that kind of fits. So your example was, of course, he's burning hot on those first three, four, five, six, seven gods, but you can kind of see the energy petering
Yep.
out, and you need to balance that out, or trim something
Yep.
back in the beginning, or
Yep.
something like that. Um,
Absolutely. And I love the way you said it, to think about the playability. That is vital.
mhm,
We're not writing, not, I mean, we do some novels, but I mean,
mhm,
when you're doing a source book for a game, you're not writing a novel. No one gives a shit about the prose and all this stuff. Even if it's wonderfully written, the reader, the players and the game masters want to get to the meat. What does it have to do with me? How does this affect how, my game, my player, my character? How does this, evolve into an adventure? They don't need a ton of fluff or a bunch of, 20 pages of history,
yeah,
unless it has some bearing on the now.
yeah,
So yeah, the playability and what the audience is expecting, and that's, one of the things I think we do really well is I figure out what the audience is anticipating and expecting, and then I work to give them more. I want to throw in surprises. I want them. So yeah, here's what you thought you were getting, but
mm.
look at all this other cool stuff.
Is there a particular writer or creator or designer out there that really impresses you right now? Like when it could be somebody either that's publishing at different companies, or maybe someone that you're working with and that you've hired. Is there someone that you look at and you're like, darn, this person is good?
Yeah, within Palladium, obviously historically Eric Wujcik, Matthew Clements, Carl Galiba, that son of a gun. He's this great game master who's been gaming forever, and he's just got a really great gut instinct at knowing what's a great idea and what's going to get his players juices flowing.
Hmm.
He's one of the best idea guys on the planet, and I usually don't give two crap about idea. I need guys who can execute.
Right.
And even when before he developed his writing skills, the ideas, and there's like a million of them. It's not like, wow, this guy sent me three great ideas or six. I mean, every freaking page has three or four great ideas. He sometimes doesn't take it far enough, or sometimes takes it too far, and I got to rein him in. But yeah, the guy is brilliant on that level. And then, of course, the reason I brought, Sean Robertson into Palladium to become my creative and business
Yeah.
partner, the guy impresses me immensely. He's got a wide range of experiences. He understands what we want at Palladium. He's into building on what's there and making it new or taking it into new directions. Um, yeah, that's why I brought him on board, because I'm like, holy crap, this guy is part me, part Wojcik, part Wayne Smith when it comes to like IT and layout and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, he's the whole package. I need this guy. you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Outside our industry, I'm sorry to say, I don't really read a lot of the other games in the last few years.
Hmm.
I hear things about certain guys, um, but yeah, I'm not really well versed in
That's
what stuff
okay.
there is.
What
Yeah.
what is, because I know I got to ask this, otherwise I'm gonna get killed by my viewers. But uh, what does Palladium do? Because it's pretty exciting to hear that a lot of times, like, people will come to you with an idea, and I think probably a lot of ears perked up as people are listening to this. A lot of like people out there that are hoping to get in, and they love Palladium. They probably know the system, maybe the setting inside and out, and maybe they think they've got a great idea. Do you take cold submissions and or warm submissions, or and if so, like, what are you kind of looking for? What really gets your blood going, like when you see something?
So, you know, um, so we had put sort of a moratorium on getting submissions because unfortunately, a lot of them aren't very good. Everyone thinks they can write. I think because words are all around us,
Mm-hmm.
on our computers, on our phones, on signs, in books, everywhere we go is words, words, words. We feel like, well, gee, we're storytellers, and especially if you're a gamer,
Yeah.
and they are. But writing professionally can be tougher, and I'm not trying to dissuade people,
Mm-hmm.
because I love giving people their first shot at things. I love finding new talent and giving them an opportunity to follow their dreams. Nothing gives me more pleasure than that. Um, but writing, and especially role playing writing, because it requires several different styles of writing. You have to understand the game mechanics. You have to understand, game balance, game theory. It's a tough job, and it doesn't always pay a whole lot of money for everything you've got to do. Eric Wojcik for a time was trying to get me into the video game business, because he was like, "Yeah, Kev, you know how much work you put into a book? This book you just got done. How long did it take you?" And I tell him, he's like, "Yeah, you get paid 150 grand to do a third of this work." And I'm like, that's cool to know, but I don't really want to work for a video game company.
Mm-hmm.
I like what I'm doing. And um so it's but yeah, so first of all, if that's what you want to do, follow your dream and give it a try. Don't be sensitive. One of the things I found with writers, and I think it's because an artist can sit down and whip out a sketch and go, what do you think? and,
Yeah.
and you can look at it
Yeah.
in an instant and go, I like it, or change this, change
Mm.
that. Your body's kind of out of perspective. A writer has to lock himself away, spend weeks and weeks, maybe months, maybe a year or more, developing what he's trying to do, depending on how expansive it is, if it's a new game or whatever. And then think about it, it's very surreal.
Mm-hmm.
It's all interpretation, because you're looking at words on a paper
Yeah.
and trying to paint a picture with words. And it's hard to do. He's having to work out game mechanics too. It's hard. Now, it can be awesome. I love what I do. And so, like I said, I'm not trying to discourage
Yeah.
anyone,
Yeah.
but I think after locking themselves away for all this time and pouring their heart and soul into something,
Yeah.
it's so precious when they're
Yeah.
done. A lot of people will turn it in, and not just to us, to anybody. And if they get negative feedback, or let alone a rejection,
Mm-hmm.
it's like the end of the freaking world,
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
dedicated the last 6 months or last year on this, and
Yeah.
USOB, you don't like
Yeah.
it. You don't see my vision. And it's like, dude, relax. Especially if we're trying to talk to you and say, you should change this or think about that, or let alone if I send you a 4 or 5 or 6 page, make all these changes. It's not, it makes come across as a criticism, and it certainly is a critique, but I'm not going to waste my time sending you these suggestions,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you've got the chops or the
Right.
potential.
Right.
And so many people just go, oh, my dreams are
That's
dashed,
it. Yeah.
and you're the evil guy who
Yeah.
did it, whoever dashed them. And don't do that. You got to try to be open and accepting of criticism and understanding you got to, it's going to take a while, and you got to grow, and you got to learn, and you got to be willing to throw stuff out and make changes.
Is there a common mistake perhaps that you've seen in your time, like something that maybe just grates on you, or something that you say, darn, if people would just get over this one little hump, they would really improve their writing or their submission by so much. Is there anything like that?
Do you want a list?
Well, let's just say that I wasn't planning a fourth hour of this. Let's try. Can we try and cap it and maybe go with one or
Yeah,
two?
I think the top three is, and I've talked about this in various panel talks and stuff. I think a lot of times, especially beginner writers, they try to be a writer,
Hmm.
meaning they sit back and say, okay, I'm putting them on my writer's hat,
Yes.
and writers do this, whatever it is they
Right.
perceive that writers do. And so they're way too verbose.
Yeah.
They're using words they don't understand.
Hmm.
They pulled out a thesaurus that, think about it. If you never
Yeah.
heard of this word because people stopped using it 50 freaking years ago,
Right.
your audience won't know what it is either. And so you're ruining your writing. When I say they're too verbose, um, or turgid, it's like,
Hmm.
let's make, they here's a sentence describing, you have to say is, it was a glitter boy shining in the sun, but instead they're going to write that line
Mm.
with, 50 freaking adjectives that you don't need. Um, it's like they think if they have more words and if it's really colorful, it'll be better. And no, you want to be succinct and
Hmm.
to the point. Another thing that just drives me nuts, truly drives me nuts, is because I get sort of trying to write and use too many words and
Yeah.
trying to be what you think a writer should be. Um, the thing that drives me crazy is massive histories or a ton of story prose, this big long story that goes on and on and on for 10 or 15 pages and has nothing to do with the book, or
Yeah.
kind of has something to do with the book, but it's like, again, it's a game book. I'm not
Yeah.
looking for a novel.
Yeah.
I don't want to see that you can write short stories. Give me some meat as a play. Again, I'm role playing the player. I'm thinking of my
Hmm.
audience.
Hmm.
Don't give me a bunch of frilly bullshit.
Right.
Get to the point. What makes
Yeah.
my character better? What villain am I fighting? What cool monsters are there?
Yeah.
Give me more information about the setting that's important to me as a character. Watch out for this section. You know, that's what we want, not just a bunch of, okay, you're showing off because you can write. Who cares?
It sounds like what you're describing are like, first of all, I'm thinking back to what you said about it's got to fit in a 96 or 128 page book, and it also sort of sounds like you're talking about giving the kind of the main tent poles of ideas so that the people that use the material can go in there and riff off of that and play off of that and create their own little world. So it's not over detailed, but it's
Right,
not but it gives you just enough of a spark
right, right.
to use that.
And that's tricky. I'd rather get something that's a little short on detail that I can
Mhm.
expand on
Mhm.
than, I got to read through all this crap and decide what's important, what's not, what am I editing. And it gets annoying
Yeah.
because, shut up and get to the point.
Yeah, get to the sure. Speaking of which, I've noticed something, and I think this is a good segue as we move into the end of our final hour here with Kevin. Um, I've noticed something in my dealings with you over the months that we've been chatting every so often. You seem to have a hard stop when you've got all of that creativity and like kind of boiling up inside of you, and it's very clear and obvious to me, and anyone that ever talks to you is going to be able to say yes. Kevin has ideas and he's excited about them. But you seem to have a hard stop at 7 p.m. Um, how did you come up with 7 p.m.? Why do you have a hard stop? How does that help you? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I sure can, because that's the thing is, as a writer, someone who's got a big imagination. Stephen King mentions it too in his Stephen King on writing, which I
Hmm.
highly recommend.
Hmm.
It's not a how-to book. It's more like how I look at writing by Stephen King and how he does it. Without getting into teaching, it's a great book. I highly recommend it.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, you need to be able to turn it off at some point. I already put in too many hours anyway. So if I'm knocking off at 6:30 or 7, um, that's probably already a 10 or 12-hour day, because my day typically starts at 7 or 8, and sometimes as early as 5:30. If I wake up early and I feel energized, I'm at the office by 6. So by 6 o'clock, it's 12 hours. By
Hmm.
7, it's 13 hours.
Yeah.
For God's sakes, go home. And then for me too, um, I just need to be able to turn it off. Like I've heard other people say, yeah, when I get home, the ideas and stuff are still going. And I suspect it was that way for me too in the early
Hmm.
days. But yeah, for me now, I come to work and I write, well, or deal with business crap. And when I go home, I'm done for the day. I want to go home and just unwind and hang with my beautiful sweetheart and watch some TV or read a book and go to bed.
I completely like I think that that's as a teacher, I think that's a really important lesson because I often have parents that come to me and they ask me questions about, well, my student or my child wanted to sort of give up on the homework and then there were lots of tears, and I'll tell them, like, at a certain point, if there are tears, you have to remember the work or the school life balance, and you've got to make it fun and something you wake up to go pursue every day and not something that you dread or fear.
Right.
And I think that idea, has it been hard to keep that 7 p.m. Like kind of cut off, or is it like
Um, Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
mhm.
Mostly, also as a business owner, what makes it hard is sometimes there's just all kinds of
Right.
demand. So at the end of the day, some new trouble has shown up or some
Yeah.
question or concern.
Yeah.
Like of our current printer, um, all of a sudden they send us a bunch of invoices out of the blue and they're wrong, and I have to explain what's going on.
Yeah.
And I'm dealing with a new person, and I wanted to go home at 6:30, but next thing I know, it's 7:30. Um, it can be tough, but no, it's not so hard for me to turn it off.
Mm.
Partly too, because I've come to realize that um, my best writing, I do my best writing in the morning.
Mm.
That'll change with different people. So by like 4 or 5 o'clock, well, I feel like I'm writing well. I've learned that when I look at it the next day, it's probably not my best writing. I'm going to spend more time retooling it than if I had just knocked off and gone home and gotten some rest, because you need
Yeah.
rest to recharge your battery. You always hear
Yeah.
writers and people talk about getting burnt out.
Yeah.
You got to kind of regulate things so you don't get burned out.
Mm.
Again, it goes back to pacing.
Mm. Flipping the coin there, how has, like, publishing and role playing and writing, how does that help you lead a, or has it helped you, contributed to you leading a happy life? Like, do you take some of that, the positive energy that you get from work, you take that home and you leave the negative stuff there, or?
Oh yeah. So for me, I love nothing more than writing and world building and or drawing. Um, and So a lot of my problems, I actually lose myself. Just like when you guys game, you lose yourself in the
Yeah.
game. One of my solaces is, even when I'm in a shit storm and everything is bad, if I can go to the office and throw myself into writing,
Mm-hmm.
it's a happy place.
Yeah.
And so that 5 or 6 or 8 hours of writing is a joy. It's fun.
Can
So it's
you
an escape.
can you tell, maybe here as maybe our final maybe bit of final wisdom from Kevin. Can you tell that prospective, hopeful, wet behind the ears writer or designer who wants to get into writing, can you tell them why they should do it? Can you recommend it to them? What would you tell them? How would you tell them to like get through all the tough stuff? Why should they be that writer game designer?
So if it's in you, it's probably a burning desire. I found most artists, writers, especially those who rise to the top, it's just something inside them. It's something they have to do. And if that's the case with you, or you just have fun doing it, do it because it's wonderful. I mean, I love what I do. And not just because of the financial rewards or the wonderful fan base that we have, the gigantic global family I've developed over the years. Those are all great, but they're like the frosting on the cake. I
Mm,
I need to write. If I sit down and don't write, I just start, and I'm not a workaholic, despite what some people seem to think.
mhm,
Um, but like after a month, especially if I haven't done anything for a month, which is rare,
mhm.
um, and I mean, been able to relax or not have to focus on work, it just the ideas start to build and build and build where I feel like, man, I've got to do this. And
Yeah,
it's a joy.
yeah.
So follow your joy, follow your dreams, whatever they are, whether it's writing, doing art, doing comics, being a movie director, an actor, whatever it is, electrician, game designer, whatever. Um, follow it so you don't have regrets and always wonder, gee, could I have done it? And then don't let the disappointments crush you. Because as we were talking about a little bit earlier, there are going to be moments and incidents where you might feel crushed or discouraged. And again, learn from what you're doing, learn from the things that might be crushing or disappointing, and say, okay, I got
Mm,
rejection number 92. Um, you know, do I really need to rework this? Do I need to move on? And that's the other thing too, is don't beat things into a bush.
mhm,
I've seen a lot of game companies where they have this vision for a game and they produce the game and two or three supplements and they sell like shit.
mm,
It happens.
mm,
Don't be, I'm a failure.
mhm,
And don't beat a dead horse. Don't, well, this game is selling like crap. Um, so I'm going to do six more supplements and throw away your money. Just say, you know what? This didn't work. How's my next project? What am I going to do next? And how do I make it better? What did I learn from this failure? And maybe the failure wasn't you. Maybe it was timing. Maybe it was packaging. Think about what it was and learn from it. If you're always
mhm,
learning, I like to think I'll learn not just from my own mistakes, which I make plenty of,
mhm,
it's learning from other people's mistakes. When I hear my gaming buddy, he released this or that and it sold terrible or it sold great, I'm listening and trying to learn from their successes and their mistakes.
Kevin, thank you for that. As a teacher, I appreciate you saying that to those that are listening and watching out there. I really do. I think those are very wise words, and I think they're very important words. And hopefully, there's at least one budding game designer out there
I
somewhere
hope
in the
so
world
too.
that heard that, and they're now going to get out that pencil and forget about that rejection letter and try to create. Um, I want to thank everybody tonight for tuning in. I really appreciate your time. This is a big project for me, as maybe Kevin knows, because I've been planning this out for like months, and I'm really flattered that he would agree to be my guinea pig for all of this. I appreciate his time. I also appreciate you, the viewers, who stuck with us through a 3 hour extravaganza of Kevin Orama. I sincerely appreciate your viewership. If you like what you see, if you like what you heard, please do think about liking and subscribing. But as I was saying before, a really helpful thing is also to share and maybe to say a positive word about the show. It helps me get creators like Kevin on. Um, finally, I just wanted to say to you, Kevin, thank you so much for entrusting me with your message for tonight. I'm sincerely flattered. I
My
think
pleasure.
seriously, like for decades now, my friends and I have been playing your games, and like I said, it's as real for me as the Megaverse is as real for me as say Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or anything like that, and they're right up there. Um, I would tell you good luck, but I know there's that you're already doing really well and just fine, and you're making all these great games, and you've got great stuff planned for the future. And I'll just say I look forward to all of those awesome things from Palladium in the coming years. Thank you so much, Kevin,
Thank
for
you.
coming on the program.
My pleasure. I enjoyed every moment.
I'm so happy to have had this time with you. Thank you very much. And to all of you out there tonight, have great games and stay safe. Thank you so much for watching. Role Player with 1,000 Faces will be back another time.